The man known to history as King Edward the Elder was born in the early or mid-870s. Unfortunately, like so many other rulers of the early Middle Ages, we have only fragmentary details of his life, and even the year of his birth is not entirely clear, let alone the month or day on which it occurred. Given what we know about his subsequent life, and the fact that he was entering maturity by the early 890s, it is almost certain that he was born sometime between 870 and 875. Edward is known in the historiography today as Edward the Elder rather than King Edward I, because the numeration of English kings reset after the Norman conquest of the 11th century. Historians centuries ago consequently gave monarchs for the centuries prior to 1066 names like Edward the Elder instead. Thus, there is the somewhat confusing situation where Edward the Elder was the first King of England called Edward, and yet King Edward I is the title given to the first post-Norman conquest monarch of England who ruled between 1272 and 1307. He acquired the name the Elder to distinguish him from his great-grandson, Edward the Martyr, who ruled England briefly between 975 and 978. Edward the Elder's father was King Alfred of the West Saxons, ruler of the Kingdom of Wessex. He had ascended to the throne of Wessex in 871 as a young man himself in his early 20s. 3 of Alfred's older brothers had each ruled Wessex before him, and he had not been expected to become king. Yet when he did, he flourished in the role, and for reasons which will become clear, he is remembered as Alfred the Great today. Edward's mother was Queen Alswyth, a daughter of Æthelflæd Mukel, a prominent lord of the Kingdom of Mercia that controlled the English Midlands and the northwest of the country. After marrying Alfred in 868, she gave birth first to a daughter named Æthelflæd, but Edward was her and Alfred's eldest son. Another boy, Æthelwold, and 2 other sisters, Æthelgifu and Æthelfrith, would follow. Given that he had only one brother, and that Æthelwold was younger than him, Edward's claim to succeed his father one day was strong, though royal succession did not, at this time, necessarily always follow the principle of primogeniture, where the eldest son of the previous monarch always succeeded. Alfred himself had risen to the throne ahead of his nephews, Æthelwold and Æthelhelm, the sons of Alfred's brother Æthelred, who had ruled Wessex before him. Alfred's claim to the throne had been deemed better, as Æthelwold and Æthelhelm were infants in 871 and unable to rule, though, as we will soon see, their claim to the throne would trouble Edward in time to come. Edward was born during a period of considerable flux in the history of early medieval Britain. Back in late antiquity, between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, the Romans had ruled over much of the island, with the reign covering modern England and Wales. They pulled their legions out of the island in a strategic withdrawal in 410 AD. Thereafter, a range of Germanic people invaded the island from the continent, the primary ones being the Angles and Saxons. With this, a period of British history known as Sub-Roman Britain began, and continued through the 5th and 6th centuries. During this, the central authority of the Romans was replaced by the emergence of numerous smaller kingdoms, ruled over by the Anglo-Saxons and pre-Roman Britons. These included the Kingdom of Mercia, which controlled much of central and western England, the kingdoms of Deira and Bernicia in northern England, and the Kingdom of Wessex, or of the West Saxons in the south of the country. Later, the Kingdom of Northumbria replaced the Kingdom of Deira in the north, while the Kingdom of East Anglia emerged in the east of the country. These were Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and they continued to rule over the regions of what is now England through the 7th and 8th centuries. But in the year 793, a new invader arrived when Viking or Norse raiders attacked the monastic abbey of Lindisfarne, off the coast of northeastern England. Thereafter, a period of English history began, in which waves of what the English came to refer to as the Danes continuously attacked England. Just a few years before Edward's father, Alfred, rose to the throne of Wessex as ruler of the West Saxons, an unprecedented invasion of England occurred when the Danes landed in East Anglia in 865. The Great Heathen Army, as it would later be termed by the chroniclers, rampaged through much of eastern and northern England over the next 10 years and established Danish rule over much of the region. One of their leaders, Halfdan Ragnarsson, established himself as the king of Northumbria and would be succeeded by other Danes, while his ally Guthrum established himself as king of East Anglia. This was a period of great danger for the Anglo-Saxons, who were now in danger of being entirely superseded by the Danes as the dominant power in England. However, while Edward was still an infant, his father turned the tide and began to offer the first effective resistance to the Danes, defeating Guthrum's forces at the Battle of Edington in 878. Thereafter, the King of Wessex engaged in a series of campaigns which pushed the Danes back northwards. This established Alfred as the preeminent Anglo-Saxon ruler in England. Thus, as Edward was growing up, there were essentially 4 major powers in England: his father's Kingdom of Wessex in the south, another Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Mercia in the Midlands and west of England, the Danes of the Kingdom of East Anglia in the east of the country, and another polity ruled by the Danes, the Kingdom of Northumbria in the north of the country. Edward would play a major role in unifying England under the rule of the Kingdom of Wessex, though he rarely gets as much credit for doing so as his father or his son Æthelstan. If Edward's accomplishments are somewhat underappreciated today, it is quite possibly because there is a comparative lack of sources extant for his reign. Some of those from which information concerning Edward's life and reign can be derived are actually primarily sources for the reigns of his father and son. One such is the Life of King Alfred, written by a Welsh monk by the name of Asser, who lived during Alfred's reign and the first 10 years of Edward's rule. He refers to the earliest part of the reign of Edward. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a series of annalistic chronicles charting the history of England between the 9th and 12th centuries, also has a substantial section regarding Edward's reign, though not as lengthy as those for other early English monarchs. Several of the works of the great 12th century English scholar, William of Malmesbury, refer to elements of Edward's reign. There is also a range of other, less specific data available for Edward's reign, notably the evidence of royal charters, the text of Edward's father Alfred's last will, and material evidence such as coins and archaeological artifacts. While these sources are all important and allow us to develop a picture of Edward's time in power, there are no detailed biographical accounts of Edward written by people who lived in the first half of the 10th century when he reigned, to shed light on his life. This is a major problem, and means that there is much that we do not know about Edward today. Asser's Life of King Alfred provides some of the only information concerning Edward's childhood and education. He received a Christian education during a time when royal children were not necessarily well educated. Some rulers of England, as late as the 12th century, were not literate, but Edward's father was a scholar and had his children well educated by churchmen. Edward was taught the Psalms and to read the Bible, some books in English, and poetry. Without it being clearly stated in any medieval source, we can assume that he would have spent much of his youth at the royal court at Winchester in southern England, and would have been taught to ride horses and wield a sword, as well as being inculcated to the idea that Christianity and the Church were absolutely central to life in Wessex. He was still a young man, probably no more than what we would call a teenager today, when he married for the first time. His first consort was a woman named Ecgwin. She is a mysterious character. Almost nothing is known about her, and some argue that she was not actually married to Edward at all, but was in fact a concubine or a mistress, though one of their sons did succeed Edward as king many decades later, suggesting that he was a legitimate child born within wedlock. That child was a son named Æthelstan. He is understood to have been born in 893 or 894. Thus, Edward and Ecgwin's relationship had begun by 893. Their union produced a second child, a daughter named Edith. Thereafter, Ecgwin disappeared. She was out of the picture by 900, when Edward would marry again. It is unclear what her eventual fate was. Edward was already playing a part in the government of Wessex during the 890s when he was still perhaps as young as 17 or 18. A fragment of a Latin chronicle from the era, written by an annalist by the name of Æthelwold, states that Edward led a military campaign against a group of Danes at Farnham in southern England, midway between Winchester and London, in 893. However, there are other sources which suggest that Alfred was in command of the forces of Wessex at the Battle of Farnham. Perhaps both father and son were there, or it was also possible that the various chroniclers were trying to simply present a more pro-Alfred or pro-Edward picture by giving one or the other credit for the victory. A year earlier, in 892, Edward was mentioned for the first time in a royal charter, a legal document issued by the Crown in Wessex. In this Latin document, he was named as Filius Regis, meaning King's Son. More informally, he bore the Anglo-Saxon title of Atheling, which essentially means prince. There are 3 further charters from the mid-890s, where Edward is listed as a witness to the document, and then in 898 he is given the title Rex, meaning king. It was not unusual in ancient or medieval times for rulers to appoint their heirs as co-king or co-emperor as their reign went on, to train them into the role. This was clearly what was happening as Edward headed into his 20s. The titles which were applied varied depending on the nature of the charters. Sometimes the rulers of Wessex were referred to as King of the Saxons or King of the Anglo-Saxons, depending on the purpose of the charters in question. These titles are important as they indicate the degree to which Alfred, and Edward as his son and heir, was claiming dominion over just the West Saxons of Wessex or all of the Anglo-Saxons of England. Edward's father died on the 26th of October, 899. The cause of his death is not known. This is not uncommon for a medieval ruler, as individuals who died often did so from an illness that contemporaries could not understand or explain. He had suffered from poor health throughout much of his adult life and was only around 50 years of age at the time, suggesting that he had some long-term illness. Unusually, a copy of Alfred's last will and testament has survived. It, along with the only other will to have survived for an Anglo-Saxon king, King Adred, a son of Edward's who ruled from 946 to 955, is held by the British Library as Additional Manuscript 82,931, or titled as the Liber de Hyde, the Book of Hyde, a name derived from it having been found in Hyde Abbey at Winchester. This ornate manuscript contains a text in which Alfred lays out the history of the royal succession in Wessex before stating that, having consulted with his council of advisers, he had determined that Edward should succeed him as ruler of Wessex, though the language focuses on the transfer of land to Edward, almost as though he was a landlord rather than a monarch. Despite the unusual language, there isn't any doubt that Alfred had made it unequivocally clear that Edward was to succeed him, not anyone else, nor was his kingdom to be divided up between competing heirs, something which had led to the division of the empire of Charlemagne on the continent in the 9th century. Just over half a year after his father died, Edward was crowned at Kingston upon Thames on the 8th of June 900, a place which is now on the outskirts of London, but which was well away from the city at the beginning of the 10th century. While Alfred's last will and testament and the raising up of his son as co-ruler in the 890s had made absolutely clear that Edward was meant to succeed him, the succession was still contested. Back in 871, Alfred had been chosen to rule Wessex by consent of the nobles and other leading figures. His brother and predecessor Æthelflæd I did have two sons though. As we have seen, these were named Æthelwold and Æthelhelm. Both were very young at the time of their father's death. Æthelhelm was the older of the two and was probably only around 3 or 4 years old in 871, while Æthelwold was perhaps little more than a few months old. At a time when the great heathen army of the Danes was conquering all before them in East Anglia and Northumbria, and preparing to come south to vanquish Wessex as well, the West Saxons could not allow an infant king to come to power, and so they had chosen Æthelred's brother Alfred to succeed him. Æthelhelm seems to have died at some stage in the 890s, but now in 899, 28 years after he and his brother had been passed over in the succession, Æthelwold pressed his claim to succeed Alfred instead of Edward. He immediately rebelled, and he and his followers, many of whom would have believed that they were restoring the rightful order of succession that had been disturbed in 871, seized control of Christchurch and Wimborne in Dorset, the latter being a symbolic site where Æthelwold's father, King Æthelred, had been buried nearly 3 decades earlier. Here was a threat to Edward's claim to power immediately after his father's passing. It remained to be seen how he would respond to this initial adversity. It is evident from his next moves that Æthelwold did not obtain a large base of support for his claim to the crown, and that Edward was the stronger contender from the outset. Instead of trying to bolster his base of support around Dorset and the southwest, he quickly abandoned Wimborne and fled northwards. When next we see him, he was in Northumbria in the north of England, where he had carved out a local power base amongst the Danes. There are even some coins that have been found from the very beginning of the 10th century which bear the name Alvadus, a Norse rendering of Æthelwold. He spent several months here building up an alliance against Edward and the West Saxons. Then, in the autumn of 901, he sailed southwards along the east coast of England, landing in East Anglia. There he convinced some of the local Danes and their king at the time, Eoric, to break the peace accord which had held between the Danelaw of East Anglia, a name for the region of Danish control here, and the Kingdom of Wessex. With further allies from Northumbria and even the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, which hoped to benefit from removing Edward and installing Æthelwold in his place, the contender marched into Wessex and raided Braden. Edward responded by launching an attack into East Anglia, hoping to draw the Danes back to their territory. The combined forces of Æthelwold, the Mercians, and Danes did not disappoint and headed east to fend off the Wessex army. The two forces clashed at the Battle of Holme on the 13th of December 902. The location of the battle is unknown today, though Huntingdonshire, now part of Cambridgeshire, is the most likely general area. It was a complete victory for Edward. Æthelwold fell in the fighting, as did Eoric, and a Mercian prince called Brythsiga. The challenge to Edward had been completely crushed, and he was now firmly secure in his rule of Wessex. By the time the Battle of Holme occurred, Edward had already taken a second wife or consort. As we saw earlier, his first wife, Ecgwin, was a mysterious character, one who some historians have speculated may not even have been his wife, but was instead a royal mistress of sorts. The uncertainty surrounding her legal status was matched by the circumstances of her disappearance. She simply vanishes from the historical records around the time Edward became King of Wessex, and not long after, he married a woman named Æthelflæd, the daughter of a West Saxon ealdorman, a senior noble. She must have been married to Edward by 901, from which year there is a royal charter extant today in which he is referred to as Conjux Regis, a term which means king's wife. She and Edward would be married for approximately 20 years and had 8 children that we know of together. These were 2 sons, Alfred and Edwin, and 6 daughters, Æthelhild, Edgifu, Edhild, Edflad, Edgith, and Edgiva. All of this can, unfortunately, become quite confusing. The Anglo-Saxons named their children alliteratively so that their names would all sound quite similar, a practice which certainly doesn't make it easy to distinguish between Edward's 14 children that we know of, especially when we consider that he had 2 different daughters from different marriages called Edgifu, while others had names that were only slightly different from one another, notably in the case of his second marriage, the 2 daughters named Æthelhild and Edhild. The suppression of Æthelwold's revolt and the challenge to his rule had reignited the clash between Wessex and the Danes of East Anglia. Much of the first decade of Edward's reign would consequently be spent trying to follow up on his victory at the Battle of Holme to conquer the southern end of the Danelaw, the Danish-ruled lands which still covered much of eastern and northern England around Northumbria and East Anglia. Edward's father had begun to aspire to rule over all the Anglo-Saxons, not just the West Saxons in Wessex, and as such is often credited with being the first medieval king of England. But this was more a statement of intent to rule over all England than something which he did in actual practice. In reality, Edward would come to exercise far greater control over England north of the River Thames than his father ever did. In the mid-900s, he began reducing the Mercians to a state of vassalage yet again, and he also moved to erect or strengthen a series of fortifications around the Midlands and other parts of Mercia. He did so by arranging a temporary peace with the Danes, the Peace of Tiddingford, in 904. In 907, he fortified Chester, and also conducted campaigns northwards in a move which violated the Peace of Tiddingford, and which temporarily drove the Danes north of the River Humber, a considerable success, though a transient one as well. These initial campaigns against the Danes culminated in either 910 or 911 in the Battle of Tettenhall, sometimes also referred to as the Battle of Wednesfield, in the English West Midlands. The forces which clashed here must have been considerable, and it was an extremely bloody battle. Edward's Wessex forces were joined by a large contingent of Mercian troops, while the Danes were led by Æthelwold and Æthelstan, the joint kings of Northumbria at the time, who were brothers, along with Ingvar, probably another brother of the Northumbrian leaders. The clash came about as the Northumbrians marched south to retaliate against Edward for his earlier campaign. They also hoped to catch Edward by surprise, having learned that the ruler of Wessex was in Kent, preparing a fleet. They had raided as far south as modern-day Bristol before the horde of Wessex and Mercia caught up with them near Tettenhall. In the ensuing battle, the Danes were clearly routed. Æthelwold, Æthelstan and Ingvar were all killed in the fighting. It is not clear if Edward was involved personally at Tettenhall, though the mention of him being at Kent preparing a fleet in the Chronicle suggests he was not. In any event, the victory here broke the resistance of the Danes and facilitated a more complete reduction of them in the years that followed. Over the next decade after the Battle of Tettenhall, Edward took measures to solidify his control over more of the country. All too often during the Middle Ages, military campaigns simply involved raiding into enemy territory, fighting a set-piece battle, and then departing once the lords there had made some small act of submission. No sooner was the enemy army departed than the local lords began exercising their independence once again. Edward was determined to prevent this. Thus, in the course of the 910s, he intensified his campaign to build a series of fortifications across the English Midlands to ensure that the Danes could not easily campaign southwards in future. These were erected at Hertford and Witham, securing London and the West Midlands against incursions from Northumbria and East Anglia, while further west he erected camps and defences at Edinburgh and Warwick. By late 914, he was able to harry the Northumbrians easily, and one of the Danish lords that had risen to power there after the decimation of their leadership at the Battle of Tettenhall, Thurketel, surrendered to him. A sign of the success Edward was meeting with in imposing Wessex control over the north and east was that Thurketel left England altogether with his Danish followers not long after this, evidently concluding that Francia on the continent was a better place to try and carve out his own principality. England was not the soft target it had been half a century earlier when the great heathen army rampaged through much of the country. The final push to reduce Northumbria came in 917 and 918. By the spring of 917, Edward was concentrating his efforts on Towcester and Northampton, two towns that are not far to the east of the modern-day city of Birmingham and are very much towards the very centre of England. This commanded the main routeways between Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, and the Danes feared his build-up of force here. They raided south to try and remove the Wessex forces from Towcester, but were repelled. The benefits of the extensive series of fortifications which Edward had built across the English Midlands over the past decade became apparent at this point. Having repelled the Danes, Edward's forces went on to capture Derby in the summer of 917. That autumn, a separate force off to the east seized Colchester, one of the last remaining strongholds of the Danes in East Anglia. By the end of the year, with their leadership fragmented and having lost many of their rulers over the past decade, large groups of Danes in both Northumbria and East Anglia began submitting to Edward. All that remained were the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw in the north: Derby, Leicester, Stamford, Nottingham, and Lincoln, One of these, Derby, as we have seen, had already capitulated in the summer of 917. Now, in the first months of 918, Edward set about seizing the others. Leicester surrendered peacefully, as did Stamford, once Edward marched into the region with his forces. Nottingham was secured through a military incursion. Finally, in 918, Lincoln also seems to have capitulated. We don't know the details of what occurred here, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in an entry under 918, states of Edward that, quote, all the people who had settled in Mercia, both Danish and English, submitted to him, a statement which clearly suggests Lincoln had surrendered too. For the first time in his reign, nearly 20 years into it, Edward had secured the full homage of Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. Edward's reign was not exclusively about military campaigns. He followed in his father's footsteps in being a committed son of the Roman Catholic Church. He allowed Plegmund, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been appointed by Alfred back in 890, to continue the work of reform and rejuvenation that he had been undertaking for many years. The Danes, who were pagans, having brought the English Church to a low ebb through their attacks on monasteries and churches over the past century. It was Plegmund who had carried out the coronation of Edward in 900 and crowned the monarch. He continued in the years that followed to reorganize the diocese of the English Church and appointed well-qualified churchmen to the most senior bishoprics. In 908, Edward sanctioned him to travel to Rome to become the first Archbishop of Canterbury to visit the Eternal City in a century, meeting there with Pope Sergius III and conversing on many matters relating to the English Church. When he returned to England, he brought holy relics associated with the Armenian Saint Blaise with him. This was just one element of Edward's wider ecclesiastical program. The reform of the diocese had lasting significance, and some of England's most important dioceses, such as that of Bath and Wells, were established out of these reforms during Edward's reign. He also oversaw or financed the establishment of numerous religious houses, notably Nunnaminster or St. Mary's Abbey at Winchester, which was founded by Edward's mother around 901, but which the king doubtlessly helped finance the building of. Winchester was unquestionably the most important administrative and religious site in England at this time, and Edward left his mark on it by patronizing the construction of what is known as the New Minster. Minster being an old Anglo-Saxon term for a religious establishment like a cathedral or monastery. The old minster at Winchester dated back to the middle of the 7th century, when Cenwalh, king of Wessex, ordered the construction of a cathedral there in honor of St. Peter and St. Paul. It cannot be viewed today for the simple reason that the old minster was demolished at the end of the 11th century, not long after the Norman conquest of England. However, for a time, it was clearly the heart of Anglo-Saxon religious worship in the south of England, and a great many kings of Wessex and England were crowned, married, and laid to rest here. Early in his reign, in 901, Edward sponsored the establishment of a Benedictine abbey, which became known as the New Minster. The abbey was right next to the Old Minster, allegedly so close to it that the monks could be heard chanting inside the abbey by visitors to the cathedral. It also became the repository of a number of important objects of religious veneration, notably the bones of the Breton saint Saint Judoc, and later the alleged heart of Saint Valentine. Once it was finished, Edward ordered the removal of his father's remains, which had been interred in the Old Minster, to the New Minster, in recognition that the idea for an abbey next to the cathedral had been Alfred's idea, though one realized by his son. The new minster and the reorganisation of the English diocese were major accomplishments in the religious sphere which Edward was clearly broadly responsible for. On the surface of it, one would also think that Edward was clearly responsible for the set of religious changes enshrined in a medieval document called the Laws of Edward and Guthrum. Guthrum was the Danish king of East Anglia between 878 and 890. As Edward was the only monarch around Guthrum's time that bore the name Edward, it is logically assumed that the laws of Edward and Guthrum relate to a set of laws introduced by Guthrum first and then by Edward a decade or so later, after the kingdom of Wessex had acquired control over East Anglia. The laws themselves concern the collection of religious dues and taxes, and matters like the observance of religious festivals, and would suggest that the work of converting the Danes of East Anglia, which Guthrum began after he converted to Christianity, was then continued by Edward in East Anglia in the 900s and 910s. The authenticity of the laws has been doubted by some historians, but what it still indicates is that there was an impression that Edward continued the work of converting East Anglia, or the Eastern Danelaw as it was also known, during his reign. This was a considerable shift, with the laws stating that Guthrum and Edward established rules around the honouring of churches as places of legal sanctuary, and that the Christian concepts around perjury and adultery needed to be honoured. What was occurring during Edward's reign was the religious and cultural amalgamation of the Danes into the Christian society of Anglo-Saxon England. While culture was intrinsically connected with religion and Christianity in the early Middle Ages in Western Europe, there were a limited number of other cultural developments in Edward's realms between 899 and 924 that the king furthered in some tangible ways. His father had started this process, and Alfred is known as the Great in English historical tradition as much for his prioritizing of church reform and education as for the manner in which he checked the advance of the great heathen army in the south of England. Edward continued his father's work in this regard. For instance, there is evidence that Latin religious and scholarly texts were being copied out extensively by monks into Anglo-Saxon English in various monasteries and religious houses in southern England during the first quarter of the 10th century. Just as the Carolingian Renaissance a century earlier during the reign of Charlemagne on the continent had seen the development of an elegant Carolingian minuscule script, so too the reigns of Alfred and Edward witness the evolution of Anglo-Saxon minuscule as English written script. One need only compare examples of early 10th century religious texts produced in southern England with those being produced 3 centuries earlier in Britain to see that the Anglo-Saxon minuscule is much more readable and artistic. The only ornately embroidered objects from Anglo-Saxon England to have survived down to the present day were also produced during Edward's reign. These included embroidered clothing and objects like a stole and girdle, in which scenes from English public life at this time were illustrated. They are a useful point of contrast with the famous Bayeux tapestry, which was produced right after the Norman conquest and illustrates the shift from Anglo-Saxon times to Norman times in the late 11th century. Finally, there were changes to the legal system introduced during Edward's reign, although, as with so much else concerning Anglo-Saxon England, it is difficult to assess exactly what role the monarch himself played in developing these new laws. There are a number of legal documents from early in his reign which are found amongst the Textus Recensis of the 12th century, which set out various legal measures. One of these was hardly a benevolent measure. It provided for the concept of trial by ordeal when individuals were suspected of serious crimes like perjury or treason. Essentially, this paved the way for the use of physical interrogation as a legal instrument in England for centuries to come, though, as anyone familiar with the concept of hanging, drawing, and quartering in early modern Europe will know, treason was considered a very, very serious crime that was punished in a brutal fashion. The concept of trial by ordeal would also inform the witch hunts that occurred across Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. Despite these legal innovations, there is otherwise a lack of royal charters for Edward's reign. Historians are confused as to why there are virtually none after 910. It was possibly because Edward relied more on his royal household rather than the established nobles or ealdormen to govern his realms, a shift in traditional practice. The popular story of early medieval England is a fairly simple one, with clearly assigned good guys and bad guys. The bad guys were the Danes who brought the great heathen army to England in the 9th century and threatened to completely overrun the country, while the good guys were Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex, who stopped the Danish advance and then pushed them back northwards, with Edward conquering them and establishing the Kingdom of England in due course. Part of the reason why this is simply not true is because it was depicted in this way by members of the church like William of Malmesbury and the compilers of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, who wanted to present the pagan Danes as the malevolent entity and rulers like Alfred and Edward as Christian heroes. This view of the period is also inaccurate in other ways. Specifically, it ignores how fragile the new dispensation was in the 10th century. Edward had turned Wessex into the dominant power in England, but his kingdom remained vulnerable to raids from Norse invaders. In 914, a raiding party of Norsemen from Brittany in northwestern France, led by two warlords named Othere and Hroald, landed in the River Severn estuary and began pillaging the surrounding region in southern Wales. They then established a temporary base on the island of Steepholm in the Bristol Channel and carried out random raids on the mainland into the autumn before moving on to Ireland. This was the precarious nature of life around the North Sea and North Atlantic during the age of the Norse migrations. Edward was a powerful ruler, but his realm was always exposed to sudden attacks from Ireland, northern France, and Scandinavia. It was not always a homogeneous domain that Edward the Elder ruled over either. Take the example of Mercia. The Kingdom of Mercia had been the greatest power in England back in the 8th century, so much so that this era in English history is called the Mercian supremacy. It had been fatally weakened by the incursions of the Danes in the 9th century, and in 883, the ealdorman Æthelflæd of Mercia had made a formal submission to Edward's father Alfred. This effectively made Mercia a vassal state of Wessex, though as Mercian support for Æthelwold between 900 and 902 had made clear, the Mercians could often act against the interest of the established ruler of Wessex when it served their own ends. Over the decade that followed, Edward re-established his control over Mercia, and Mercian contingents fought in his armies against the Danes on numerous occasions. There were simmering tensions, though. In particular, Edward's incorporation of London and Oxford into his domains was viewed poorly in Mercia, these having been traditional spheres of Mercian power back in the 8th century. It was in this context, and while he was otherwise preoccupied with reducing the 5 boroughs in the north, that the Mercians began to shift away from under Edward's rule in the late 910s. The evidence for any Mercian revolt is admittedly quite tenuous, but there is some there all the same. Back in 911, Æthelred of Mercia had died, and the rule of Mercia then switched to his wife Æthelflæd, a daughter of Alfred the Great, who was also Edward's sister. She ruled Mercia on his behalf for several years to come, but when she in turn died in 918, and the throne passed to her daughter Ælfwine, Edward's niece seems to have decided to try and exercise a greater degree of independence. This would explain why Edward seemingly had her deposed a few months later, and would also explain why the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that all the people who had settled in Mercia, both Danish and English, submitted to Edward late in 918. If the Mercians had not revolted, then why would they have needed to submit to Edward again at this time? Therefore, it seems fairly clear that Ælfwine tried to free Mercia from under the rule of her uncle when she became Lady of the Mercians. This revolt failed. She was deposed, and it brought to an end the semi-independence of Mercia. Henceforth, there would be no royal line within Mercia. Edward was its ruler, and so were his successors amongst the Anglo-Saxons. To finalize this closer absorption of Mercia into his dominions, Edward had the Kingdom of Mercia divided up into shires and other administrative units in the final years of his reign, appointing lesser nobles to govern these on his behalf. The Mercians would resist these developments in the final years of his reign and in those of his sons and successors, but there is no doubt that Edward amalgamated Mercia more closely into his kingdom from 918 onwards. The late 910s saw a new development in Edward's family life which had considerable implications for England's politics over the 10th and 11th centuries. Around 919, he took as his third wife a woman named Eadgifu. She was the daughter of Sigurholm, Alderman of Kent, in southeastern England, and the granddaughter of Æthelwold, a lord who had exercised a form of kingship over Kent back in the middle of the 9th century. Eadgifu was consequently from a family of Kentish royal blood. Exactly what had happened to Ælflæd, Edward's second wife, which allowed him to marry once again, is disputed. The great 12th century scholar William of Malmesbury claimed that Edward had put Ælflæd aside and that she took up religious orders, paving the way for him to marry again. But many historians doubt this version of events and are more inclined to think that Ælflæd simply died towards the end of the 910s. Edward's third marriage would result in 4 children in as many years. 2 boys, Edmund and Adred, both of whom would eventually become kings of England, were joined by 2 daughters, Eadburh and Eadgifu, after her mother. Eadburh would never marry and would go on to become a leading female figure within the English Church, so much so that she was canonized within a decade after her death, which was around 953. A fable has it that when she was an infant, Edward sat her down on his knee, with rings and bracelets on one side, and a chalice and a copy of the Gospels on the other. When she reached out towards the chalice and Gospels, he knew that she was meant for a religious life. These years, in which Edward was producing new children again via his third marriage, saw him marrying some of his children from his second marriage into the noble households of continental Europe. Around 919, Eadgifu, the daughter from his second marriage, not to be confused with his third wife, or the daughter also named Eadgifu from that third marriage, married Charles the Simple, the king of the West Franks in what is now France. Thus, Edward's daughter became queen consort of one of the great Christian kingdoms of continental Europe. Through her, Edward's grandson Louis would become King Louis IV of France, ruler of the West Franks between 936 and 954. Though Edward would not live to see it, his other two daughters from his second marriage, Edhild and Edgith, would also marry prominent continental lords. In Edhild's case, she married Hugh, Duke of the Franks and Count of Paris, in 926, while Edgith married Otto, the son of Henry the Fowler, King of the East Franks in Germany, in 930. Otto would eventually go on to hold the positions of Duke of Saxony, King of East Francia, King of Italy, and Holy Roman Emperor. The marriage of these daughters of Edward into the leading continental royal houses firmly demonstrated how far the royal house of Wessex had risen. Back in Edward's childhood, his father had been battling for the survival of the West Saxons in southern England as the Danish onslaught continued mercilessly. A half-century later, his son ruled most of England and was establishing marriage alliances throughout the lands of the great empire Charlemagne had once ruled. The early 920s witnessed one of the most remarkable episodes in Edward's reign, though it is an occurrence which has generated considerable debate as to what it signified. In the oldest surviving copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we hear that towards the end of his reign, Edward received the submission not just of the lords of Northumbria and northern England, but also of what were referred to as the King of the Strathclyde Britons and all the Strathclyde Britons, who then called Edward their father and lord. This event must have taken place around 920 or 921, as there is mention in the passage of a lord called Ragnulf, who we learn elsewhere in the Gallic Annals of Ulster died before the end of 921. Whatever the exact date was, the significance is clear. Edward received some sort of formal submission from the King of Strathclyde, Owain ap Dyfnwal, while historians agree that King Constantine II of Scotland also paid homage to Edward. This is extremely significant. Throughout the High Middle Ages and the late medieval period, the kings of England would repeatedly argue that they were the legitimate rulers of all of Britain, and that the monarchs of Scotland were their vassals. This would sometimes result in English control being established over Scotland, such as occurred during the reign of Edward I in the late 13th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry suggests that Edward the Elder was the first ruler of England to ever receive a formal submission from the monarch and lords of Scotland around the year 921. Thus, not only had Edward built on his father's work of establishing Wessex as the preeminent power in England, but he was now aspiring towards a universal kingship over all of Britain. There is some debate amongst historians of England in the early Middle Ages as to the extent that Edward really received the submission of the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde. That there is some disagreement on this is because it was seemingly such a temporary measure. Not long afterwards, Edward's reign drew to a close. Indeed, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle suggested that the submission of the Scots was one of the last events of Edward's reign, though the dating must be slightly out given the reference to Ragnulf as being involved. Instead, the final act of Edward's reign was a revolt by the Mercians, in alliance with some of the Welsh in 924. Edward campaigned north and crushed the revolt at Chester in the middle of the summer. He took ill not long afterwards and died at Farndon, just south of Chester, on the 17th of July 924. His remains were interred along with those of the majority of the early medieval kings of England at Winchester, though unlike many others who were interred in the Old Minster, Edward's body was laid to rest alongside his father in the New Minster that he himself had ordered the construction of. In 1110, on the orders of King Henry I, the remains of Edward and his father Alfred were reinterred at Hyde Abbey, another Benedictine monastery built outside the walls of Winchester, Henry seemingly wishing to develop the abbey as a pilgrimage site which would benefit from having Alfred's remains in particular kept there. The abbey suffered damage during the Civil War, known as the Anarchy, in the middle of the 12th century, and was further desecrated during the dissolution of the monasteries undertaken by King Henry VIII in the second half of the 1530s. Both Edward's and his father's remains were lost, although an archaeological survey in 1999 uncovered a pelvic bone near the abbey, which it was speculated could have been from either Edward or Alfred's remains, based on the dating of it. Edward was succeeded by his son Æthelstan, born in the mid-890s from his first marriage to Ecgwin. A 12th century text known as the Textus Rufensis claims that Æthelwold, one of Edward's sons from his marriage to his second consort Æthelflæd, initially succeeded Edward before dying a month later and paving the way for Æthelstan's ascent. This is disputed and is not substantiated by other texts. Æthelstan's reign proved just as successful as Edward's and Alfred the Great's. He continued to wage war against Mercia and the Danes of the Kingdom of Northumbria, completing the conquest of Mercia, which Edward had done so much to advance. A sign of his success against the Danes was seen in that the King of Northumbria, Sihtric, had to call upon allies amongst the Vikings of Dublin and the Gaels of Scotland in order to try and hang on to his crown. Even with this alliance of Danes, Scots, and Irish Vikings coalescing against him, Æthelstan was able to firmly wrest control over Northumbria through victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. With this, the work that Edward and Alfred before him had undertaken to transform the Kingdom of Wessex into the Kingdom of England was broadly completed, and we find Æthelstan claiming dominion over all of England by issuing charters referring to himself as Rex Anglorum, meaning King of the English. Æthelstan achieved this, but it is impossible to imagine it having occurred had it not been for the work which Edward undertook over the quarter of a century of his reign. Moreover, Æthelstan was the first English ruler to issue documents in which he aspired to be Rex Totius Britanniae, a Latin term meaning King of all Britain. Again, the seeds of this were seemingly sown in the manner in which Edward accepted the surrender of some of the Scottish lords towards the end of his reign. After the reign of his son and heir, the power of the centralized English kingship that had first emerged out of Wessex during the reigns of Alfred and Edward continued to go from strength to strength. It also continued to feature Edward's sons. Æthelstan did not marry, and did not have any legitimate children to succeed him. Consequently, when he died in 939, he was succeeded by Edmund, a son from Edward's marriage to Edgifu. After a short reign of 7 years, he was in turn succeeded by his brother Edred, who then ruled down to 955. Thus, after his passing in 924, Edward was succeeded by 3 of his sons in a row. 2 of his grandsons via Edmund, Edwig and Edgar, would follow that down to 975. This was a period in which the gains made during the reigns of Alfred, Edward and Æthelstan were consolidated. That being said, it was not an era in which the Anglo-Saxons unequivocally defeated the Danes. Indeed, in the early 11th century, the Danes would seize control of England, and Knut the Great, a Danish king, ruled over a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. His reign in England was nearly 2 decades long between 1016 and 1035. and the Danes continued to play a major role in English politics down to the Norman conquest of 1066. Thus, what Alfred, Edward and Æthelstan achieved wasn't so much the defeat of the Danes and the creation of a monolithically Anglo-Saxon England after more than a century of invasions, but rather a centralized English kingship, one which could be claimed by both the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes, who were, in any event, becoming less distinguishable from one another as the two groups intermarried and mixed culturally. England would become one of the most centralized and strong kingdoms in Europe during the High Middle Ages, and that, rather than the victory of the Anglo-Saxons, was the real success of Alfred, Edward, and Æthelstan. King Edward the Elder is one of England's most unfairly overlooked monarchs today. He has constantly lived in the shadow of his father and his son. Alfred earned the sobriquet the Great on account of his achievements in stopping the Danes from conquering all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the second half of the 9th century, while Æthelstan was the ruler of Wessex, who first made unequivocal claims to an English kingship. But in many ways, it was Edward who did the most consequential work in uniting England under a single Anglo-Saxon ruler. He emerged from a power struggle with his cousin Æthelwold immediately following the death of his father to become Alfred's successor as ruler of Wessex. Then he engaged in a series of military campaigns in the 900s and 910s, which broadly completed the conquest of Mercia, while also launching a series of campaigns against the Danes further to the north. Towards the end of his reign, Edward was in a strong enough position that he was the first ruler to aspire to an English kingship who seemingly received a submission from the Scots. Thus, while the dearth of documentary evidence and other source material makes it difficult to reconstruct the events of Edward's reign in substantial detail, it appears that he did a lot of the heavy lifting in transforming the Kingdom of Wessex into the Kingdom of England. Alfred checked the Danish advance in the south, and Æthelstan completed the unification of England under one ruler. But it was the man in between, Edward the Elder, who seemingly conquered more of the country than the other two. As such, he has probably been unfairly marginalized in the story of the emergence of the English kingdom at the end of the first millennium. What do you think of King Edward the Elder? Was he a relatively minor king during this period, one who was overshadowed by the more successful reigns of his father, Alfred the Great, and his son, Æthelstan? Or should he be viewed as being just as successful a monarch as his predecessor and successor? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.